Thank you, everybody, for joining us here on our session on taking root in Catholic culture. We are very, very pleased to have Professor Duncan Stroik here as our guest this evening. Professor Stroik is uh, an author, an architect, and a professor of architecture at the University of Notre Dame. He has built the Holy Trinity Chapel in California, the Chapel of the Holy Cross in Tampa, Florida, Christ Chapel in Hillsdale, and he's also built a church quite close to us here in South Carolina. He's the architect and the genius behind the new St. Paul's in Spartanburg, which is here in our own deanery. So we're pleased to have him here to talk about the relationship of our faith and architecture. And Professor Stroik, thank you very much for joining us. I think you've got some pictures to show us and just a few words to say at the beginning of our discussion.
Sure. Father Longnecker, it's great to meet you and be here. And of course, I know of your work around the world, and especially those amazing theological blogs that are always so compelling. And so it's nice to be here with you and discuss sacred architecture.
Thank you.
Let's start with a few images. So Father Longnecker asked me to show you a few things as we begin, just to open up the discussion. And these are just a few buildings in the US that have been done in recent years, and your humble servant worked on them. This is a shrine, a pilgrimage shrine in Wisconsin, shockingly dedicated to Our Lady of Guadalupe. And it is a place that you climb a hill to get to, as in many of the great shrines of Europe. You go on foot, you go as a pilgrim, and there you see the miracle of the roses, and you see the miracle of Our Lady appearing to a Mexican Indian, Juan Diego, and asking him to do things for her son. And we did this about 15 years ago with Cardinal Raymond Burke. And it's a simple exterior out of stone with a strong skyline, and then the interior is meant to be a theological study of the Virgin and of her names in the Litany of Loreto, and of various devotional elements. There you see the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe based on the original in Mexico, but in this case made out of mosaic. Grand baldacchino to highlight the holy altar, and another canopy much smaller over the place of the Word of God and the preaching at the ambo. Has a number of side altars, and this is one of my favorites on the right, which is dedicated to Saint Maria Goretti, who you can also see beyond there on the left Divine Mercy and Saint Peregrine, and a number of devotional saints that people can go and pray to. All these are original artworks commissioned for the shrine. And Tony Visco was the kind of head artist who helped coordinate probably about 8 or 10 artists who worked on this, and various artisans from Italy and Spain and the US. A great project, challenging project, and very exciting to dedicate it to Our Lady under her name, Our Lady of Guadalupe. This is the dome, which is actually has the, you say, what's going on there? The ceiling of the dome is the stars in the sky on December 12th, 1531. I'm not sure why we picked that date, but.
Was that the date of the apparition?
Yes, that's the date of the apparition. And that was a wonderful idea of Cardinal Burke. And then this is a project we did at a college campus in California, Thomas Aquinas College. And it too is kind of on a, it's on a bit of a hill, and you can see it from far away, and it's got a very tall bell tower and a dome. And this one was interesting because the client is a great book school, and they wanted a church that would embody all of the great works of Western architecture. And so I said, no problem, we can do that in one building. But it does have aspects of the mission, but also of the greater tradition of classical tradition that you might find in Spain, where people like Junipero Serra would have, studied. And it also references great buildings in Italy, Florence, Rome, etc. The tower has 3 arches in honor of the name, Our Lady of the Most Holy Trinity. And like other great buildings in the world, the pediment is surmounted by a statue of the namesake, and has an arcade that continues around to the rest of the campus. And then you come in, and it's a little basilica, albeit cruciform, and a dome. And it's fairly simple in terms of the iconography and the coloration, because this is a college and a chapel for, I like to say, for philosophers. And so there's a lot of thought, 7 arches, and the symbolism that you could associate with that. The sacrament of confession is right in the middle as you walk down the aisle, and a large baldacchino, which is one of my favorite things to do for a freestanding altar, out of bronze in this case, with Solomonic columns to help to highlight the sacrament and to highlight the sacrifice of the Mass, little altar rail, and side altars, which have a particular relevance to a college dedicated to the great books and to St. Thomas Aquinas. This is a more simple and economical project for a boys' school in Florida, Jesuit high school chapel, 900 boys. And they had a building on site that they wanted us to renovate. And it had many, many problems. And it looked like a Pizza Hut, which I kind of like pizza, but they didn't think it was that great for a chapel. So we looked at that, and we looked at, could we build a more proper new chapel? And we cost out both options. And they decided to go with the new chapel. So it's a very simple cubic building with a portico, a porch, and the 2 great founders of the Jesuit order, St. Francis Xavier and the other guy. That's a joke.
Ignatius Loyola.
Thank you, Father. And then you may be able to make out just barely the symbols to either side of the window are symbols that relate to the name of the church, Holy Cross. So they're the elements of the Passion. And we have lots of nice Jesuit symbolism on the outside. On the front, the side is pretty simple. You can see that on the right. There's Father Hermes. Interior seats up to 900 boys and teachers, and it's just an octagon, and it has an oculus and a light coming in. And I've always wanted a client who would pay me to design a centralized church that is a round or octagonal or square church, and the Jesuits rose to that occasion. And it has a sanctuary set apart and a strong high altar and a tester rather than a baldacchino. And the images were all painted by a wonderful Spanish painter, Raul Berzosa, who captures, I think, very much the gutsiness of the Jesuit tradition. And this main painting on the left above the tabernacle is the kind of miracle of La Storta, where St. Ignatius is walking with his brothers to Rome. And they go to pray in a little chapel in La Storta, and Christ and the Trinity appear and say to him, I will be magnanimous to you in Rome. And they go on to Rome and found the order and get the support of the Pope, and many other amazing things happen. On the right, you see one of the 4 side chapels in the corners of the octagon, and these are to 4 Jesuit martyrs from around the world. The viewers may know this Jesuit who was from the 20th century. and was killed by firing squad in Mexico.
Blessed Miguel, Saint Miguel Pro.
Thank you, Father. Yes. So great project, simple building, but with some really wonderful complex parts. And that's something I believe in, is if you can't do the whole building with great materials or great decoration, then let's at least emphasize certain elements. And of course, the most important thing is the cry room. No, sorry, the sanctuary. I'm sorry, sanctuary.
Well, thank you for that introduction and showing some pictures of your work. It really is very impressive, and we're so pleased that I know, and I speak for myself and an awful lot of Catholics in America today, that there is I think, a resurgence of good classical traditional architecture coming back into the church after several decades of, in my opinion, rather brutalistic architecture. And I think maybe one of the basic distinctions that we could make between some of the modern sort of round, uh, bland churches that have been created was a distinction you made in one of your articles some time ago when you spoke about the difference between a building and architecture. Could you talk about that for a few moments? What do you
Sure.
mean? What do you mean when you make a distinction between buildings and architecture?
Yes, and I'm wondering if Nathan can turn off the screen. Is that right? Do we need to do that? Or are we showing up okay?
Yeah, we should
Okay,
be.
great. So buildings and architecture. Yes, so I like to compare buildings to prose and architecture to poetry,
Uh-huh.
and so that relates to your comment about beauty. And so we need buildings. We have to write text. We have to talk. We have to communicate. But when the text rises above that to something poetic, to something inspiring, to something beautiful, that's where architecture comes in. So I don't consider all the buildings that we construct or all the churches that we have as really, they're not architecture with a capital A. And so architecture with a capital A needs to have three things. It needs to have beauty. It needs to have permanence. It has to be well built, and it needs to have a sense of convenience or function. But the convenience and function is not just merely functional. It needs to embody its function. So a church needs to help us worship, for instance, and help us to pray and inspire us. It needs to be transcendent.
When I was an art student for a couple of years, I can remember this little motto of modern architecture, and I don't know whether it really comes from Frank Lloyd Wright or not, but it was form follows function. And this has brought about a real wave of very functional modern architecture. And I know a lot of architects kind of sniff at that little motto and say, yes, well, it's a lot more complicated than that. And of course it is. But do you feel that that little motto, form follows function, has been the cause for some of the very functional buildings that we've been given as churches rather than beautiful buildings?
Yes, definitely, Father. So yeah, Frank probably used that form follows function, and they like to give credit to his boss, um, Sullivan,
Uh-huh.
as inventing that idea. And Sullivan was no modernist, but he certainly was interested in expressing a steel frame, say when he did a brick building, and he did some wonderful kind of Romanesque, modern Romanesque buildings. So it's really Sullivan who starts that, but it was used by all the modernists, form follows function, to get rid of ornament, to get rid of tradition, to get rid of arches, to get rid of color, to get rid of a human scale, all things that Sullivan would have been horrified by, because he did all of those things. He used arches, he used columns, he used traditional materials, he used ornament, a lot of ornament. He's famous for his ornament, Sullivan-esque ornament. So that's the irony, is that they take this quote. And I would just add to that, one of the things that modernists have been very good at over the last 60 years is PR. Their buildings aren't particularly good. The roofs leak. People don't like them. They're uncomfortable, but they're really good at PR.
Right. And one of the things which we as you know, we've just built a beautiful new traditional church in Greenville, South Carolina, for the parish of Our Lady of the Rosary. And one of the things which came up in our discussions, and it was really exciting to work with the building committee of lay people and to engage them in these questions and to get them thinking about some of these questions, because um, they weren't stupid, and they just were not educated in art and architecture, and to engage them in some of these deeper questions about what is a building and what is a church and what is it for, was really exciting to have those conversations. And of course, you've probably experienced this in some of the initial meetings with a building committee of a church, of a parish, is they are very concerned about functional aspects. Where will the cry room go? Will there be a bride's room? Will we be able to incorporate a parish kitchen into the church? Where will the toilets go? And all of these practical matters, which of course need to be dealt with. But um, it was great to see our people, once we began to look at pictures of traditional churches, to begin to get the vision and to share the vision of what our church could be and how beautiful it could be. I can remember when I began talking about beauty, they drew back, because for them beauty meant uh, expense was another word for expensive, and we were on a very limited budget. We're not a very big parish, so can you speak to that? Is beauty, does beauty always mean expensive?
Yes.
It does.
No, but so beauty should be our goal if we believe that our churches are temples of the Holy Spirit, of the temples of the Trinity. And so we should do our best, and we should expend as much money as we can afford, whatever that is.
Right. So
And
it should be costly, but I think when I say expensive, they were actually meaning luxuriously,
yeah,
overly expensive.
right.
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 So,
No, I'm kind of kidding, but it should cost more than our house. It should be better materials than we would use otherwise.
right,
But again, getting back to this idea about, so if you have a certain budget, I think you spent $6 million, and it's a nice sized church, 450. Where do you spend the money? So we need to have either make the whole thing beautiful, which would cost, let's say, $20 million, or we emphasize certain things, or we have lots of art that's really mediocre, or we have a couple of things that are good. So I would err on the side of lesser things that are higher quality, and
right.
a few things that are of really great quality. And depending on the parish and the architect, you can make different decisions like that. But there's lots of great simple buildings that have an amazing altarpiece, or a beautiful ceiling, or a fantastic floor. And then, of course, there's the ones with the really amazing bathrooms and the amazing cry rooms. Those are the ones that I don't do. But it's where I believe that with a budget, you prioritize. And I think people really need to focus on that. And I believe in your case, you got the community to come along to prioritize that God's house needed to be beautiful. And so, you make compromises other places. Is that true? Did you have to make compromises other places?
We did. So there were certain decisions I will never forget. For instance, we have a beautiful baldacchino in our church as well, which is brings the focus to the altar. And some of the building committee members halfway through were saying, "Father, we need to save money. We don't need that baldacchino. We can put it in later."
Yes.
And I was saying, we will not never do it if we don't do it now. And so we invested that. Our architect also said, he was very good. He said, look, spend your money on the things that people will actually be in touch with, the things they will see every day, the pews they will sit in, the doors they will use. This is where it will have the feel of quality, even if in some of the other areas, high up, you're using some plywood instead of, some more noble material.
Yeah.
And so we were able to make those decisions step by step, and our architect was very wise on that. Someone's asked a question here about some of contemporary examples of contemporary churches, which we will come to in a moment. And one of them is Gaudi's Holy Family um, Cathedral in Barcelona, which we'll talk about in a moment. But I would first like to ask you your opinion of some of the modern churches in America. In the post-Vatican II era, there seemed to be a craze for churches that were built in the round or fan-shaped churches. uh, very often built out of poor materials and poor workmanship. Uh, have you ever been called in to spruce one up? Is it possible to renovate them and bring a sense of dignity and a sense of reverence into a building like that?
Yes, it is. Uh, we have been asked to do that for a number of projects. The most, probably the most successful, although on a budget, was St. Teresa Church in Sugar Land, Texas, outside of Houston for
Yes, I've
Father
been there.
Reynolds.
Yes,
And we really, there, it was a fun story because he had a daily mass chapel that seated 100, and they had some money and they said, well, let's fix it up. So they closed it off. We fixed it up, made some nice things and added a confessional and did this and that. And, pretty nice. And they opened the doors and people were like, oh my goodness, it's so much nicer than our main church. So then that got people excited to do the main church. And so then we spent, and I want to say, these were not expensive projects, but we did like you, we had a baldacchino and we had some proper statues and some good artwork. And, but the building itself remained, the well, kind of a fan shaped cruciform, whatever that is, a crucifix shape. And so we weren't able to redo the whole interior, but for affordable kind of amount of money, I don't remember what it was, it's less than $1 million, we're able to transform it. And then we went on to do a school there and some other things. They were a great client. I think it can be done.
One of our friends from here in Greenville went to be the organist there, and so I've been down and visit them and met Father Bart. It was amazing. Is it Father Bart who was there at the time? I think so. He did a great job, and you've done a great job in fixing one of those buildings and trying to bring a sense of Catholic tradition into a modernist building. Um, so that is possible if the people need to have a will to do it. Are you inclined in most situations to begin with a bulldozer?
Yes, I think God gave us a lot of wonderful machines, and one of them is a bulldozer and a wrecking ball. And most of those buildings that you don't like were not really built to last more than 50 years, and some of them are failing after 20 or 30. So, eventually they're going to fail. They usually tend to be electricity and gasoline hogs, and they're very uncomfortable to be in for people. And most importantly, the way that you talk, Father, they're actually turning people off from the faith. So if you can afford to turn people off from the faith, then don't fix up your church. But if you think that
I'd like
that's
to, I'd like
actually our
to, I'd
mission,
like to, I'd like to pick you up on that point, and that is architecture for evangelization. One of the thrilling things as we were building our new church was to find how people would come into the back of the church, and this was anybody, children, the workmen who were building the church, the Protestants who are our neighbors. They come into the back of our church and they look up. It's we've got a nice verticality to it, and they look up, and the first thing they say as they enter into the church is, "It's beautiful." And I'll say to them, well, what do you find beautiful about it? And they'll look around and they say, well, I like the stained glass windows or whatever. And I'll say, uh, the thing is, you knew it was beautiful. I said, but you didn't have words for it. I
right?
said, and therefore beauty transcends language. And they're looking at me like, what are you talking about? And I explain that this is the point of a beautiful church, that it takes you beyond language. And you came in here and said, it's beautiful, but you didn't have any other words to talk about other than that. And these were not just, illiterate, builders. These were educated people who also had that same experience. So you can tell I get passionate about this,
Yes.
that the architecture therefore lends itself to evangelization. Just last week, one of the members of our church who just came in at Easter after a year's RCIA went across town to one of the suburban fan-shaped Catholic churches. And as soon as he walked into that church, he said, this doesn't feel right. He says, I would never have joined a Catholic church if this was my church. Now, I know that's just an anecdotal one
No.
person, but still, it was a powerful witness and testimony that when he came into our new church with not only the architecture, but fairly traditional worship and music and so forth, this was part of his conversion process. Have
Yeah,
you had, I'm sure you've had similar experiences
yeah,
or
we've seen
witnesses.
a lot of people being touched by a building that is not just merely an auditorium, but speaks of higher realities, speaks of something eternal. And our buildings are God's house. So what do they speak of God? What do they tell us about the Trinity, about the Redeemer? And if they don't speak of that, then what's there to keep us? What's there to draw people to conversion? So yeah, that's your building your new church is an evangelist, and we need the help. We need every help we can get in evangelization.
And I was very moved. I think that one of the first meetings we had with our building committee, when I said, "What kind of church do you want? Do you want a suburban fan-shaped church, or do you want a traditional church?" They said, "The traditional church." I said, "Good, we're on the same page." And I said, "But why do you want a traditional church?" And I was just very touched, and still remember when they said, "Father, we live in the Bible Belt, and we want our church, Catholic Church, to look different than all the other Protestant churches in order to make a stand and to make a witness." And I thought that is an excellent reason for spending this money and building this church. And they got that, from the start. And it was just, I'm convinced that if our buildings were beautiful, then our faith would be communicated as being more beautiful and beautiful, good, and true. Going on now a little bit
It's a
further
great
about
story.
a wider sort of question. I've been very lucky and blessed to live in Europe for 25 years, in England, and to worship in some of the most beautiful buildings in Christendom. For 2 years, I was a chaplain at King's College, Cambridge, which
Wow,
combines some of the most sublime music and sublime architecture anywhere.
wow.
The experience of Anglican worship in that building is just unbelievable. And therefore, I've soaked up a lot of the architecture and the history of Europe. And what interests me is the interplay between the sacred buildings and the secular buildings. What is your opinion of how can a beautiful church, for instance, help to evangelize not just individuals but to evangelize the culture? Is there a dialogue between sacred architecture and secular architecture?
No question about it. And historically, our temples were the high point of architecture, and our other buildings, whether they're palaces or later on civic, governmental buildings or commercial buildings, would, on the one hand, defer to the temple because the temple is God's house, but also they would learn from it to be respectful, to be part of you might say, the court of the king. And so the courtiers would dress appropriately. And so we had a wonderful history of cities and outdoor rooms, piazzas, that would defer to the king, defer to the church. And of course, in the modern age, the secularists, in a sense, rightly so, have rejected the temple because they see where it leads. And they want to reject that and eventually come up with a modern architecture that rejects the past and turns its back on the temple and the temple architecture that would be. So one of the things we're trying to do in the classical movement and at places like Notre Dame and at Catholic U and Benedictine College, various architecture schools around the country, and the Institute for Classical Art and Architecture in New York, is to bring back, not necessarily religion, but bring back the architecture that was part and parcel of our, international tradition of classicism, which is the temple, but it's all of these other buildings, and it's respectful of the human being. And whether you believe it or not, whether you know it or not, it's also reflects something above and the Godhead. It's something eternal.
So where we're located, for instance, in our Romanesque building with columns and arches and so forth, let's say there's a vacant lot next to our campus, and let's say we were going to build an assisted living center there for an old people's home.
Wonderful.
You would say that let's design the assisted living center using some of the vocabulary of the Romanesque church, and therefore
Definitely.
the church is contributing to the whole community in a
Yes.
beautiful. And we
Yeah,
see
we need
this
that.
when we see this when we go to cities like Florence, when we see that the churches are in harmony with, as you say, the piazza, with the um, the housing and so forth. There's a kind of unity of vision.
Yes, a unity, yeah, and it's a way for the church, whether you build the assisted living on your property or other people build next to your church, it's a way for the church to really, the church can be charitable in many ways, and this is one of the ways that we can really help our cities and communities, as you're varying, is is to sponsor the architecture and set a standard that other people can, participate in or dialogue with us. It's great.
How long, how far would you take that? Would you say if they're building a retail strip and a burger joint that they should also echo the classical architecture, or is that pushing it too far?
Well, we see on the strip and we see on the highway, we see, good buildings and bad buildings, not too many good ones. But it is possible to do a nice building on the highway or in the strip. So I'm certainly in favor of doing good architecture everywhere. But it's also nicer if we can create the environment for a more humane architecture, and that tends to be a more walkable, pedestrian friendly, which ultimately means it's a more human scaled architecture. So I fortunately never had to design a church on a highway on the strip, but if you had to do it and did it well, it would still be a beacon and very positive to people driving by at 55 miles an hour.
Well, and some of the older churches, older Catholic churches, are now in communities which are seriously decayed and have, were, let's say it was built in the 1920s. I'm thinking of especially the Basilica of the Little Flower down in Texas,
Yes.
where a beautiful basilica was built in a thriving community. That community is no longer thriving. It's very depressed and it's very run down. But the basilica still stands in the middle. But now it's in the middle of a rundown community, and but still gracing that community, and still bringing the level of life up by by being there.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think that there are a number of people who have studied this, and they find that when you decommission those churches or tear them down, these beautiful churches, that it really hurts the neighborhood even more. These tough neighborhoods have a bit of hope. They have a bit of life because of these churches, and I believe in the churches for our tough neighborhoods. That we need to those of us who don't live in those neighborhoods need to help support them and keep them going, because they are a beacon of hope.
Which brings me to another question that has come up here, in our preparation, and that is, um, what is your response to the large number of people who will say, "How can you spend so much money on art and this beautiful building when there are poor people and the food pantry needs help and the homeless mission is needs a building and so forth?" Do you have a pat response for that sort of critique?
Well, I'd like to paraphrase St. John Cardinal Newman, who said, "We do both. We have to do both. We don't have a choice. We have to take care of the poor. We have to feed them. We have to be missionaries, and we also have to do beauty, because we're called to honor God and to do excellence for Him, for His name. So we really need to do both." But a second point, of course, is that uh, maybe the middle class or the wealthy appreciate beauty. What about the poor? What if we give them something that's beautiful? And a church is for all people, much more than a museum, much more than a restaurant or hotel. It is for all people of all walks of life, and anyone is invited to visit. And so, where else can you go as a street person and see beauty in architecture or in art, but in a Catholic church?
And maybe some of those people who would go to church would be very unlikely to shell out $15 to go to an art museum and look at pictures all day long. But they would see the stained glass windows, they would see the art, they would see the mosaics in the church, and actually, like I said, our school children would actually they live with it. They actually it's part of their world, it's part of their day, it's part of their education to come into our church and worship. Talking about the relationship between a beautiful church and a needy community, our parish is actually located in the uh, most deprived socioeconomic demographic in Greenville County. Surrounding our church are rundown hotels that have been turned into flop houses. We have drugs, we have gangs, we have prostitution and human trafficking, we have unemployment, we have a lot of social problems right there. And one of the most moving things that has happened to me in my pastorate was to be doing my prayer walk around the parish and have one of our local residents, who's probably from a low income family, say to me, "Are you the pastor of that church over there?" And I thought they were kind of getting mad at me, and I said, "Yeah, that's right." They said, "Thank you for investing in our community." And they're not a member of our church. They probably go to the Pentecostal church around the corner,
Yes.
but they saw what we were doing as Catholics, and they were impressed, and they were evangelized by that, and just shared their thanks with me for what we'd done. So it's a
Beautiful. What a
yeah.
beautiful thing. Yes, that's a great word. We are investing in our communities when we build. And when we build beautifully, we're investing beauty. So thank you for doing that, Father. That's
Yeah.
great. That's a great story.
Yeah, and investing in our children and their education and their understanding of the role of beauty in not only in worship but in life generally, um, and that it's sometimes worth paying extra to do, go that extra mile. I can remember another story when we were trying to raise the money for the pipe organ. The same argument came up. What, why don't you just get an electronic organ? You don't have to have a pipe organ. And the pipe organ salesman said, "Tell me," he said, he challenged this person, "Tell me," he said, "when you proposed to your wife," he said, "did you go and buy an artificial diamond?" And the guy was just stepped back, sort of like, and he said, "But an artificial diamond would look just like a real diamond, right?" And he said, "No," he says, "I want a real diamond." He says, "Well, I make my point."
Yes,
Um,
I like that.
so I'm sure you've had similar conversations over the years.
Yeah, that's great. For the pipe organ, that is a great argument. Yeah, we need to have proper instruments and we need to do the best we can. And if we can't afford it, then go without for a while.
Yeah. I asked you earlier as we were getting ready for tonight's conversation about two rather famous churches. I don't know whether your assistant has been able to find images of them, but it's the church in the Shrine Church in Fatima in Portugal, um, which someone recently described to me as a fry pan. In other words, I think it's a big round church. And then across the border in Spain is the church of by the architect Gaudi of the Holy Family, the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. Do we have images of those? Yeah, there's the modern building of the Holy Family in Barcelona.
Yeah, and if I could just say a little bit about this for a minute while we find Fatima. Yeah, no, these are a nice comparison because they're two contemporary buildings. They both cost a lot of money. They're shrines. They're kind of national shrines. They're kind of international. Sagrada Familia is a real draw in Barcelona, as well as, of course, the great apparition site of Fatima. And so they're interesting to compare. Now, Gaudi designs this early 20th century. It continues to be built up through today. So it's an older design, but it's being fabricated today. And it's taken a long time to build from its beginnings.
What materials are they using?
So believe it or not, most of what we're seeing on the outside is stone.
Hmm.
A lot of it looks like concrete, and that's part of the architect's and the sculptor's desire to do something more plastic, more free form. But it's actually with a lot of stone, or much of it is stone. So it's built using traditional techniques. And these are a lot of towers on one building, very, very tall. I mean, this is a feat of engineering, this building, much like some of the well, like many of the French Gothic cathedrals were feats of engineering, like the cathedral in Florence, the dome, and of course, St. Peter's are feats of engineering. So it's pretty amazing that way. People find this very compelling because it's a cathedral or a cathedral-like building being built today, and I think people are wowed by it a little bit like they would be wowed by St. Peter's, but also a little bit like they might be wowed by Disneyland. It has an exoticism about it, a strangeness, a craziness about it that many people love. I especially think young people love the craziness of it, as well as really old people love this because it seems kind of modern, it seems kind of up to date, even though it's designed in, up through the 1940s. It's really
Looks like,
1940s design.
looks like something out of Star Wars, doesn't
It
it?
is. It's okay.
Yeah.
There you go. And maybe the movies help to appreciate it because there are scenes in Star Wars where you see cities and flying saucers that have architecture like this. Yeah, and maybe even a little bit of Lord of the Rings. Some of the elfin cities might remind you of this. To someone who is steeped in Gothic architecture or in classical architecture, it's pretty wacky. It's pretty crazy, hybridized. But it was Gaudí trying to take the Gothic tradition and do something inventive, innovative in his own mind. And it's a very personal. It hasn't led to a lot of other architecture, which is kind of one of the things that I consider important for buildings is that they can be a wonderful one-off, and I think, or they can be part of a tradition. And I think Sagrada Familia is a wonderful one-off. It's not leading us into a new tradition or a tradition of architecture. So it's fine, it's great, but it's a little bit of a one-off in my view.
And you would stick with neoclassical.
I'd rather build something today that is in the tradition of the great Gothic cathedrals in all of Europe, and we have a couple of them in this country, or in the great Renaissance Baroque tradition. If you're going to build something majestic, that's what I would do. But somebody's free to do something more.
Is it possible for a parish to build a church in the Gothic style today?
Yeah, I think we do see some nice Gothic buildings. America, because of our Irish and German immigrants, loved the Gothic in the 19th century, early 20th century, and we have lots of buildings, and many of them are fairly simple, and they tend to be made out of cheap materials on the inside and the outside, so they're not crazy. But if we say, a Gothic cathedral in France, a cathedral like Notre Dame, or a Gothic cathedral in Germany or Spain or something, parishes really can't do that today, or they don't do that. How about that? They don't. Maybe could they? Sure. We just need to spend the money. And they are kind of crazy buildings to do today, like the Sagrada Familia is kind of a crazy building. But I don't say that in a bad sense. I just crazy, like time consuming, expensive. Can you really find an architect to design it? You have to be steeped in the tradition to design it. And of course, there are people like Ethan Anthony who are building Gothic parish churches around the country.
But presumably they would not be built from out of stone. They would be built with a steel frame and clad in stone.
Yeah, they tend to be done that way, and they tend to be
the Cathedral of Our Lady of Walsingham down in Houston
Yes.
is an example, I think, of English Gothic. It's really a kind of replica of an English, perpendicular Gothic church.
Yes.
Steel structure, but clad in Texas limestone.
Yeah.
So it's pretty. It's a pretty church.
It is.
We have
very nice.
we have an example of the picture of the fry pan up here as well. Can you talk us through that a little bit? What's the point? What's happening there?
Yeah, and I think that this is the best view of it because the new basilica or church at Fatima is really it's another one-off, but it's a diagram. And I was taught at Yale, and many architects were taught that the key was the diagram. And you can see the diagram, right? It's a circle, a low cylinder with a couple of bars through the middle, which have skylights over it. So it's a diagram, and it probably looks best from above. It's not so much for inhabiting, it's not so much for inspiration, but this is like so many modern churches, it's meant to accommodate a lot of people. The old Basilica at Fatima is a very elegant early 20th century building with a spire and a proper proportion and so on. And this is a horizontal meeting place, which has a very interesting mechanistic exterior, albeit not cheap. I mean, this was an expensive building by a famous architect, but I have no idea who did it.
Right. You say that it's interesting in that you use the word that it's a horizontal meeting place. Doesn't that reflect the a lot of the theology in the post-Vatican II church as well, that we are moving away, that some people would like us to move away from a vertical experience between a meeting between us and God to be a horizontal experience between us and other people and us and the world. Thus, some of the mentality of the suburban, what I call fan-shaped churches or circus tent churches, are the family of God is gathered together around the family table, which is the altar of the sacrifice. So the architecture that we struggle with as American Catholics is actually reflective of a theological difference, or at least a different difference of emphasis about the Eucharist itself. Would you agree with that? And is this why you have a tester or a baldacchino over the altar?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. No, I mean, these buildings do make statements, and they make theological statements, and some are strong and some are weak, but they're all telling us something. And as you said, they have an ability to evangelize or to push people away. They have an ability to catechize or to teach people falsehoods. And I would say that as sermons in stone or in concrete, this building in Fatima, as well as many of our churches in the last 60 years, are teaching us all the wrong things about God and about our neighbor and about the sacraments and about eternal life. They're teaching us the wrong things, and so we really should tear them down as kind of heretical, or
So to make another statement.
yes.
Now, Professor Stroik, you work with pastors, with bishops, with cardinals, with people, ordinary Catholics who are building churches, and the conversations that you have with them, do you find that they generally love their modernistic fan-shaped churches, or do they just put up with them?
Um, I think that I think the fan shape was very in style in the 70s and 80s. And of course, we got it from the Protestants. It's a preaching, auditorium. And it's an auditorium. And it was, as we developed fan shaped auditoria, then they said, well, let's just do it for the church. And then eventually the Catholics are a little slow on this and they grab onto it. And of course, suddenly all kinds of bad things happen. The ceiling gets low, you carpet it, you make it less resonant so you can hear, fit a lot of people in there. The ones I like have cup holders. Suddenly it becomes a profane, banal building. And I think they were in style in the 70s and 80s. And I think a certain generation, let's say people over 70, still like them. It's what they built. It's what they were used to. And pastors of that time period. But unfortunately, they were sold a bill of goods, and the young people and even the middle-aged are not. It doesn't do anything for us. It doesn't inspire us, and
Right.
so we may worship there, we may go there, we may tithe, but a building should do more than just be something we put up with, but it should help us to pray.
When I travel around the country and to go in some of these churches, I don't try to pick a fight, but I'll say to the people, well, do you think is your church beautiful? And
Mm.
they'll usually say something like, well, everybody likes the padded pews, or, the sound system is really good or whatever. But they fall back on functional things about the church, but none of them say that it's actually beautiful. To give them their credit, quite often you'll see there's a Catholic instinct to make it beautiful. Um, and what they tend to do, I found, is that they will load it up with potted plants, or they'll load it up with uh, cheap statuary or icons which are bought out of a catalog, because they want it to be beautiful, but they're not sure how to do that. Sometimes, and you've seen this as well, well-meaning people will simply buy large prints of Leonardo's Last Supper and plunk it up on the wall, believing that they're, putting art in their church. They haven't. They've just decorated like they might their living room. Um, do you actually design not only churches and schools and so forth? Have you designed domestic buildings as well?
Yes, we've been fortunate to have a couple of crazy clients who would let us help them do a house, and we have also worked on religious houses, monasteries. Um, and I find that very inspiring. And I have to say, the thing that I'm most excited about, and we're working on one right now, and I meet people around the country who are doing it, is in their new houses, there's a certain generation of people that are investing in making a prayer room and a
A
prayer
little,
closet,
a
and it
little
turns into a
oratory.
chapel.
Yeah. Nice. Um, yes, and I've been in the homes of some fairly well-to-do Catholics where they've created quite an extravagant little chapel.
Yeah,
And they meet there for family prayers, and they belong to a maybe a small religious community where instead of having a home Bible study, they have a home meeting which actually combined with the rosary or mass or whatever in this little chapel.
it's very
And
exciting.
yeah,
I think
and
that's a real way forward for us to, uh, this is a, this is a kind of a nice little chapel in a house in Nebraska. And it was dedicated to Holy Family. And it started out as a prayer closet, and then it kept getting bigger. And eventually the family who were up on the front right said, we want to have our whole, our kids and our grandkids there. It turned into a 50-person chapel in the biggest room in the house. So yeah, this is a great thing, and people that can do this, I would encourage them to consider it. And if they want something this nice, they probably can find an architect willing to do it.
this is actually a very interesting development because having lived in England for those 25 years, uh, some of the grand old houses in England, of course, had their chapel, had their sometimes a separate building altogether, which would serve for the family and for the, of course, all of the servants, and in those days all of the outlying extended family. Um, it's a beautiful tradition. Also, some of the parish churches, some of the ancient parish churches would have an extra aisle or an extra chapel added on by the family, which would also become the like the mausoleum. So that's where they were interred, and that's where they were ancestors were. It's a beautiful idea. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's a beautiful idea that should return, and the more that we, as the word you used, is the more that we invest in the sacred, the more the sacred can permeate our lives and to help others.
One of the other questions which has come up, which I would like to ask you, is do you have is the relationship between architecture and the liturgy? Um, what are your thoughts on that? Why is a beautiful church important for a reverent celebration of the liturgy?
Hmm. Yeah.
Why?
So I think you can do a guitar mass or a casual mass in a beautiful cathedral, but it doesn't. You can do it, but the building is pointing us to something reverent, solemn, spiritual, something beyond us. And the modern liturgy and much of the way that we have interpreted it tends to be, about ourselves, as Pope Benedict said, a circle turned inward on itself. Whereas the historic cathedrals always point us away. It points us to the communion of saints. It points us to Christ in the Blessed Sacrament, Christ on the cross. It points us to the Trinity, you see the angels and saints around you, the angels worshiping. It points us beyond ourselves, which is what we actually need. We need more focus outward on heaven, on eternity, to help us do a better job today. And so it's very exciting to do a building that speaks of doing something elegant and solemn. And whereas the contrary is true, that in an auditorium, a fan shape, it's harder to do something relevant because the building is not pointing us towards God, and the liturgy is. So they're fighting each other.
When I first came to the parish, the leader of the Boy Scouts, who's a committed Catholic, was taking the boys to Charleston um, to do a tour of Charleston, and especially to visit our Catholic Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, which is a pretty impressive neo-Gothic structure there in Charleston. And of course, Charleston itself is a city that's rich in architecture.
Yes.
And he was intent on taking them there because he said, our boys have never seen a building, a beautiful church, a beautiful church building like this. So we went and they shared in our cathedral. Um, what hints would you give to perhaps the educators who are watching this evening, the homeschoolers, the teachers, um, to try to um, infuse an enthusiasm for beautiful architecture and traditional architecture um, into our educational system, into our Catholic education, for our children? How would you do that? I know you have a Department of Architecture at Notre Dame University. They're not all going to go there and become architects, but how can they appreciate church architecture and the history of church sacred architecture in their educational processes?
I think that's a great idea, Father. It's part of our sacred patrimony, part of our Catholic patrimony. The art and the architecture of the Catholic Church is one of the highlights of the history of the world and the history of architecture, and we should know it, just like we should know the scriptures and the catechism and the lives of the saints. It's one of the things, and it's meant to point us to those things, to those truths. So I love your idea of the Boy Scouts going to the cathedral. I think families should bring their, when they're out and about, take their children to see the local church or the historic church or the historic cathedral. And when you travel to another city, visit the cathedral or visit the church. If you can, visit the shrines across the country, some of the great shrines to different saints, to different apparitions, to Our Lady, and bring the children there for a time when it's not for Sunday, but it's just a time to be a pilgrim.
So when
And
you're
then the best
but
of all is to go see the great works of art and architecture that our patrimony has given us in Europe.
right. So when you're planning your vacation, plan to visit St. Louis and the cathedral there. Plan to visit the the basilica in Washington and so forth, and find these buildings and make a point to get there. St.
Yes,
Patrick's
amen.
Cathedral. When you go to New York, go to St. Patrick's
Definitely.
Cathedral.
You got to
Yeah,
go to St. Pat's. It's
yeah,
fantastic.
yeah.
And everybody else is there too, so it's really fun.
Good. A question has come in from one of our listeners. Do you prefer to place the organ and choir in a loft at the back near the altar or to the side? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I've been fortunate to do a number of organs and design organ cases, I think for 5 or 6 organs. And most of the time we've done them in the choir loft up high in the back. The music people will tell you from a acoustical point of view, it's nice if it's on the central axis, front or back. Even though some of my favorite buildings in Venice do it, I'm not a big fan of putting the organ up center because in America that hints of the Baptist tradition. So I try not to do that, but it certainly works and it sounds great. There is that other type of organ, though, the smaller organ that the French love, which is the orgue de chœur or the choir organ, which is up front. It's off to the side. It's smaller, and it's supporting the monastic group or the liturgy of the hours or something like that, as opposed to the one in the back, which is really supporting the congregation. So we've done a little bit of both, but I certainly love the choir loft. I think it's an invention that works very well. And it's not, the early Christians did not have choir lofts, but it's a great invention that works well and it sounds great. And with a small choir and a small organ, you can actually speak to the whole church because you're up there high and you're able to speak across our heads and go to the front. So what we've done.
In England, I was amazed to learn that very often in the Middle Ages, the choir would be on top of the rood screen, and that
Ah,
they would actually be right there at the
yeah.
crossing between the nave and the sanctuary. And there was of course, no pipe organs back in those days. Would you say a word, please, about your feelings about Renaissance Baroque churches? If you go to Rome, of course, you're going to be greeted with the Baroque tradition, with all of its ornamentation and its frescoes, and cherubs, naked cherubs tumbling out of heaven and holding the clouds open and so forth. Um, is that something that you appreciate? Something which you uh, think has any value for our worship today?
Certainly, I think that when the Catholic Revolution comes, we'll see a Baroque cathedral in America. That's what it will take. And I like the way that Pope Benedict talks about, he says really the high points of Catholic architecture are the Gothic and the Baroque because they both lead our minds to heaven. There's nothing that leads you upward more is the Gothic and the Baroque. That being said, we have 2,000 years of great architecture and art from the simplicity of the early Christians through the, the vaulting of the Romanesque to the complexity of the Gothic to the simplicity of the Renaissance. We have lots and lots of great architecture, and I think they all can be learned from. And I really believe that we should learn the tradition with a capital T and see it as there's a continuity. And I teach a class right now on the Renaissance in Venice, and I say we couldn't have had the Renaissance church architecture without the Gothic. You couldn't have had the Gothic without the Romanesque. You couldn't have had the Romanesque without the early Christian basilica. So we really should, whatever your favorite style is, we really should appreciate the whole continuity of it. And it's
Well,
all
I can remember first going to Rome, and the Protestant boy in me went into these Baroque churches, and I was like, "Well, no, this is way over the top." You know, all of the filigree work and the ornate plaster work and so forth. And I forget who it was said, "Just stop and don't be so judgmental, and try to understand what they were doing back then," and explained how this was in many ways a response to Protestantism and the austerity and the iconoclasm of Protestantism, and saying just that. The Catholics were saying, no, look, when you come into church, heaven is opening. And they were trying to communicate with all of the cherubs holding the clouds back and so forth, so that you could get a glimpse of heaven. That they were saying this is what worship was about. They were trying to communicate this visually. Um, by the way, for all of our listeners, next week we're going to be talking more about art with our guest Liz Lev, who actually lives in Rome and is a tour guide in Rome, and will have an awful lot to say about this as well. What is the style of the Basilica of the Sacred Heart in Washington, D.C.? Do they mean the Basilica of the Sacred Heart, or do they mean the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception?
probably the Immaculate Conception. That's
I think probably the Basilica of
the only basilica in DC.
Yes.
Which, well, so that is a building that is a 20th century church and meant to balance out or be a Catholic answer to the National Cathedral, the so-called National Cathedral with it, which is English Gothic, wonderful building, but really a Protestant building. And so the Catholics responded with a building that wasn't the cathedral, but kind of a national building and a shrine to Mary. And so they wanted to do something distinctive. And so it has multiple domes, which we think of as being Byzantine. It has a lot of mosaics also. And so it has a quality of, let's say, early medieval Romanesque and Byzantine. And it's definitely a 20th century building. It's well built, incredible building. It's our largest church, largest Catholic church in America. And of course,
Would you say that
capital.
it has links, or was it inspired, or any kind of influence from the Byzantine style that was emerging in France about this same time period, the of Basilica of Sacré-Cœur and the Basilica of Saint Therese in Lisieux?
Yes, no question. That's what this, I think that's where this comes from, even if unconsciously, is there's a whole movement in France, especially to look for and bring up to date various older styles of church architecture. And one was this commingling of the Byzantine and the Romanesque in Sacré-Cœur in Paris, which is one of our great shrines in the world. And it's a little bit like Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, but these great shrine churches that are meant to stand out and be present. And the other one that comes to mind in our country, of course, is St. Louis, the Cathedral of St. Louis, the new cathedral. So there is this whole kind of Byzantine movement around 1900, 1880 to 1920 that some Catholics embrace, and we've produced some amazing buildings with it.
Well, thank you for your insights and your sharing your learning with us this evening, Professor Stroik. This has been really enlightening for me, and I know that our listeners and our participants have really enjoyed you being here with us. We're coming to the end of our time. A question has come in, which is about the use of Gregorian chant and so forth in the liturgy, which is, I think, is a little bit off topic and not one that I can really address authoritatively, only to say that the Gregorian chant is usually more sympathetic to the words of liturgy, especially if you're using Latin. But Gregorian chant, it's easy to sing Gregorian chant badly. And I would say that it's probably better to attempt music which is more accessible and more easier to do it well. In other words, it's probably better to do non-Gregorian chant well than to do Gregorian chant badly. But if you have a good music director who's sympathetic, then that can work, and I would recommend it. We're going to sign off now and close with a closing prayer, and just a bit of a few practicalities. Our course on taking root in Catholic culture is going to continue next week with Liz Lev. The week after that, we talked to Barbara Nicolosi about film. And then the final week, May 26th, we'll be talking to Father J. Scott Newman, about the relationship between liturgy and the world. How does liturgy function to evangelize? How does liturgy function to catechize? And if you are signed in for this meeting and you've registered for this course at Our Lady of the Rosary's website, then you should receive automatically the link to come in on the Zoom meeting next week. If you have problems with that, please connect through the Our Lady of the Rosary website. Caitlin and Curtin and Katie Orban are the assistants in helping to administer this course, and they will help you with any problems that you might have. You could just send them an email. We're going to close now with the ancient prayer of St. John Chrysostom. Almighty God, who has given us grace at this time with one accord to make our common supplications to you, and promise that when 2 or 3 are gathered together in your name, you will grant their requests. Fulfill now, O Lord, the desires and petitions of your servants, as may be most expedient for them, granting us in this world knowledge of your truth, and in the world to come, life everlasting. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Thank you again for being with us. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Professor Stroik, and your assistants for being here with us this evening. Thank you so much.
It's an honor to be here with you, Father.
Thank you.